Hello, and welcome to another podcast, or actually my first podcast, if I can ever get it right. I've been struggling with the right platforms to use in these instructional videos, so I'm going to go with Notability. Keep in mind that podcasts in the future may change because I may find a better program. But for Mac, Notability seems to be the one that's working. So today I'm going over document design, and I pulled up a basic essay. It actually may look familiar as an example essay on one of our assignments I've put out there. I just changed the names. So if your name is James Smith and you were in my class, do not think this is yours and do not use it as yours. So document design pretty much goes along with, this is with Modern Language Association, also known as MLA, just simply MLA. So with MLA, we look at just a set of rules that go with writing, and so most of our essays will be done in this way. So let's talk about margins. Margins at first are not too difficult. Most of all, it's standard in most word processors. Today, I'll be looking at pretty much dealing with Word and dealing with Google Docs, and I'll talk about that in a separate podcast, but just so you know which one I'm talking about. I'm a big Mac fan, and I usually don't do a lot with Mac word processors as like Pages. It becomes too difficult to migrate from one system to another, but that's for a different conversation down the road. So back to margins. Margins, are typically 1 inch all around, okay? And so 1 inch all around, and that's typically you don't have to do anything about it. It does it by default. But there's an exception to the rule. And the exception to the rule is, except between the page number and the edge of the page. And that's in the top of the page. And so what I'm looking at here is, just so you know what I'm talking about, is that we're looking at between here and here, and that's usually a 1/2 inch, and that's usually just a 1/2 inch. Again, it does it by default in most cases. Now, for me, I have no preference when it comes to this, but Google Docs typically screws this up and will put like a 1/4 of an inch or maybe even an 1/8 of an inch, even smaller. You can fix it. It is difficult, and so I've learned to live with it. But some instructors down the road may not learn to live with it. So just keep in mind that when it comes to me, that I just require it to be in the header. As long as it's in the header, I'm okay. Okay, so it has to be in the header. Now, with that said, everything else is pretty simple. The inch margins are between here and here are usually easy to do. And then when it comes to indentation, it's either 5 to 10 spaces. Okay? Or what I do is just tab. Tab usually works for me. Okay, so that should do it about margins. And so we want to make sure that we understand what that's all about. Let's talk about font now, okay? Font is not too tricky either. However, you can't always rely on the default font, okay? And so when it comes to font, we want to keep it in Times New Roman. Okay, let me move my text box here so you know what I'm talking about. So it's usually 12 point Times New Roman. And for all my classes, this is what I require, okay? And so that's what we want to make sure that we have. Now, these notes will be available for download. So I'll put the PDF out there on the site, so it shouldn't be a problem. But typically where a lot of students mess up is between, is not considering that page number. That page number also needs to be in 12-point font as well. Okay, so keep that in mind. You want to make sure that it is, uniform throughout. And I have ways of telling. A lot of times by default, word processors will make that 11-point font. I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference between 11 and 12. So just keep that in mind as we move along, okay? All right, so I'm going to move this over here. And as we grab this, I want to talk about the information block. Now, the information block, let me get things organized. And the information block is, there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. And even MLA will have its own standard, and different professors and instructors and teachers will have their own standard as well. I am not a big stickler, as long as it has these three things. And you want to keep that in mind because it is a final exam question. As a matter of fact, the margins is the final exam questions. The font will be the final exam question. So you kind of want to keep these in mind. I tend to drill these in over and over and over. So when it comes to, make this font a little smaller so we could fit it all in. It's not working. There we go. Okay, so when it comes to margins, I want to make sure that we have, not the information block. Information block, and I also call it the info block. Has a couple of things. Number one is the student's name or the writer's name. First and last is fine. Two, I need to know what the class is and also the section or block. Depends where you're taking my class. The other one, I need the date. Now, this really gets some teachers wrapped around the axle. I really don't care as long as it has the month, the date, and the year. I don't care if the date comes first and then the month and then the year, or it's just month, day, then year. I really don't care. The next one is a big one, is the assignment itself. And it's not the title of the assignment, but what is the assignment called? It is, like in this case, it's the future analysis essay. This becomes a big issue when we start submitting revisions or even late work, if I accept it. If I get something late and I don't know what it is and you left this off, I have done this before. I have graded one essay under a whole different criteria thinking that it was the essay that's due, not the one that was due a month ago. That's a very rare exception. And another big thing is you need to have your instructor's last name. And so you don't have to call my first name, but just my instructor's last name. Okay. Now keep in mind that the information block is the only block that is the only part of the essay that may be single-spaced. Okay, it's the only part. Does it have to be single-spaced? No. Can it be double-spaced? Yes. Can it be triple-spaced? No. So this is just some finer things when you start writing your essays and what's required. Okay. All right. Now that brings us to our next thing, which is spacing. Spacing is important. Spacing throughout the essay, to include the works cited page, which is a separate podcast, is always double spaced. And so spacing is always double spaced. Now, this usually does not become a problem, but students tend to think, I've run into students who think that, double spacing is hitting enter at the end of every line. No. I will walk you through this in a moment when we look at Word or when we look at Google Docs. But again, this is double spaced. When I get an essay that's single spaced, it's very hard for me to make annotations. It's very hard for me to read. Single spacing is usually reserved for letters and so forth. But when it comes to essay, matter of fact, I can't think of any assignment for me that would be single spaced. So always do double spaced. Okay, so we talked about indentions, we talked about spacing, let's talk about the page number real quick. Let's talk about the page number. Let me make some room for that. I'm running out of room here, so I want you to see what we're looking at here. Okay, so the page number is always in the header. The page number always begins with your last name. Okay, matter of fact, I might write this in here so you understand that. So it's your last name, not mine. Sometimes when I put example essays out there, I'll use my last name as an example. If you're downloading my essays and typing over it as a guideline, which is perfectly okay, make sure you take out my last name and put your own. So it is the student's last name. Let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit. And there we go. All right, so it's the student's last name. So that sucked. And I ran out of room for the E there. Okay. Now, you can manually put this number in here. I recommend you do not. But you can. Okay, so as long as you look smart, that's not a problem. But you got to make sure that it is beginning with the letter, the number for the first page. So it's always going to begin with 1. Okay. There are no more cover pages. No cover pages. That's very old school, and so there's no cover pages. So you know that the first page number is always on the first page, was where your essay begins. Okay. All right. So now that you understand that about page numbers, I'll show you how to insert that in just a minute. Okay. All right. So let's zoom back out and let's head back to the essay itself. Okay, so looking at document design, and that's always the first part of looking smart. It's the first thing I look at when I grade papers is I look at just say, hey, does it look like an essay? If it's all in blocked or if it has 3-inch margins on each side and looks like a poem, I know there's a problem. Okay, so going through here, I'm just looking, and so you'll see this essay when you get there and how it works. We'll get into the other aspects as far as punctuation and other grammar things later down the road in another podcast, but I just want you to see what an essay looks like. The next thing that is always a huge problem, it's a big headache, is the works cited page. I would tell you that it is often, the works cited page, I often abbreviate WCP, is often the most difficult page to format. Again, that's a whole different separate podcast, but just to hit the highlights. Okay, first of all, that it does have a what you want to see here is looking at what is called a hanging indentation. A hanging indentation, there are ways to put that in there. One way is manually, but I tell you, most time when I see people do it manually, it is a nightmare, because when you have to add other annotations or you add other sources, it's a huge problem. Okay, it is a huge problem. So hanging indentation, I will show you how to do that when we get to the works cited page, and I think, matter of fact, that might be our next or the podcast after that one. So it should not be too difficult. Another issue that people often forget is back to the old page number. This becomes a nightmare as far as editing. Like I just told you on the hanging indentation, a lot of students, to include myself, will keep the works cited page as a separate document and just print it out when it comes time to print the essay, and then go from there. Thing is, if you're going to keep it separate, make sure that it follows the sequential. It follows a sequential pattern. So if your conclusion paragraph is on page 2, as in this case, you want to make sure that your works cited page would be page 3. So the works cited page number is always sequential. I'm using that word right. Okay, so you've got to follow. And a lot of times what I see is students will make that, it'll come out as a page 1. And I know that they kept it separate, they're trying to do the right thing, but when it came time to revising and proofreading, they just totally missed that. Okay, so just make sure as we wrap this up, I just want to make sure we're hitting everything. I don't see anything I have forgotten, but let's go over a few rules as far as I'm concerned. Okay, and we'll just call these additional document design rules or something like that. Okay, so we say general rules. That's better. Okay, and so one is that we do not, never use bold type. You don't want to do that to bring attention. This is not a, we're not creating flyers for marketing. Usually when we use bold type, and we use that for titles. So you usually underline or use italics instead. And that's for things like titles, major titles. So we'll talk about titles and later down the road. Matter of fact, I'll just clear that up right now. Major titles. Okay, so the next one would be use quotations for smaller titles. And that would be chapter titles, articles, etc. The mistake students often make is they place the information block into the header. So do not place the information block into the header. How I know this happens is when students do this, it will pop up on every page. That information block will be on every page, and then that doesn't happen. Okay. Also, do not place an information block on the Works Cited page. Okay, so it's just it's part of the essay, but you have to keep in mind too. I rarely give page requirements like no less than 3 pages, anything like that. You'll understand when we get into essay construction. But if an instructor ever does and says, "Hey, I need a 3-page essay on Africa," whatever the case may be, you cannot count the Works Cited page as one of those pages. That's just a little information you might want to tuck away for future use. Also, back, I forgot one thing. Let me go back up here and look at the title Works Cited. Okay, the title Works Cited here is always centered. Okay. It's always capitalize the first word. Okay, I do that a little better, I think. So, but sometimes students will call this, we'll say Works Cited page. No, do not do that. That does matter. Okay, and we start looking at other formats. If we get into that, such as APA or Chicago style, sometimes they're called bibliographies, sometimes they're called references. It's all the same thing, but in MLA we will always refer to this as the Works Cited page. One last thing on Works Cited pages is for me, as far as a rule, is that you always include the URL. I need the URL. We'll talk about this when we talk about validating sources, but I need the URL to be included in this. So let me just make a little note there. So always include the URL, which is the full web address. Okay. And we'll talk about that more to follow when we talk about validating sources such as primary and secondary and so forth. Okay. All right. Well, this should cover it for document design. Keep in mind also that your staple should always go in the top left-hand corner. And it's a big part about looking smart. You want to turn in an essay that defines the work you have done, or at least the work you wish you had done. So if it's all crumpled up and folded, and you pull it out of your back pocket to turn it in, that's going to send off the wrong signal. It's all about looking professional and communicating effectively. Again, this ends this podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I also would like to know if I made mistakes. I often do. And so just keep that in mind. If also misspellings, keep in mind that I'm not perfect, and this is one of my first podcasts. So I appreciate your patience. And again, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.